Why is LSA taxed? Why is disturbance expense lower when coming back to the UK from overseas? Why doesn't LOA cover a spouse's loss of earnings? The answer to these questions and more in this episode. Hey everyone, and welcome to The Savvy Squaddy. In this video, I sit down with one of the team who works on the allowances policy, and I ask him the top questions many of you submitted. Let's get straight into it.
Thanks for having us back, Cameron. I think the last couple of episodes went down quite well. It was met with a bit of positive feedback, but as ever, there's no end to the questions. And so I know you've received quite a lot from your followers. So we're here to really help and close that information gap and be honest with our answers. I'll answer to obviously the best of my knowledge, but I'll give you some balance in the answer. So I'll give you all the actual thinking behind it and a bit of the history if needs be, in order to give a decent explanation of why things are the way they are. We're trying our best to improve the offer in a fiscally difficult climate, but happy to help, Cameron, and thank you for having us back.
And thank you for taking the time again out of your day. But let's just get straight into it. So I recently did a video on disturbance expense, and one of the questions that came up was, why is the rate lower for people who are returning from overseas back to the UK?
Okay, really good question. One that I had when I came into the job, and I'd gone out to Cyprus to see the battalions and our other service personnel there, try and get a bit of evidence and a bit of the feeling out there. And, the really valid question is, I get the overseas rate when I go to an overseas location, but if I'm assigned back to the UK, I get the UK rate. It doesn't seem logical, but something that is quite steadfast in its nature is disturbance expense is based on the accommodation type you're moving to and the location you're moving to. So the return to the UK is therefore based on a methodology of expected costs when you come back to the UK. And so some elements will not be applicable. So when you go out to an overseas location, more often than not, people will utilise a storage element in the UK. And therefore, part of the methodology as to why you get the overseas rate is to pay for insurance whilst your items might be lying in storage in the UK somewhere. Now, when you return to the UK, and let's say, for example, you occupy SFA again, those items in storage are more likely than not going to be recovered from storage and placed into your future SFA. So therefore, you're not paying for that insurance element whilst you're on your next UK assignment. So a very simple example, but it goes to show that there's probably about 3 to 4 elements of disturbance expense that are applicable when you're on your overseas assignment, but when you return to the UK, it's not applicable. So therefore, the rate is based on the UK. So we've got a bit of an issue with that, in that the overseas disturbance expense for overseas locations isn't frozen as a result of SDSR. And so that has continued to rise, usually in line with CPI, but the UK rate has remained frozen. Now, there is a bit of a give and take here, in that some moves will cost more, some moves will cost less across a full career. And it's a fair assessment, I think, that over a full career, it will probably balance out. I think it's a really appreciated expense in that it's not receipted and it's a contribution, so it's completely tax-free. In an ideal world, if I had the affordability to try and up that UK rate, I would, but it remains frozen because of the significant amount of expense that it does cost the Army. So, I absolutely accept that point, and that sometimes people will consider it harsh in isolation if they're just doing one overseas assignment in their career, perhaps. But if you think about it, close to £3,000 tax-free on 2 assignments in and out does go quite some way to smooth out those issues between when you land in an overseas assignment and when you recover back to the UK. So hopefully that answers the question. In an ideal world, I would have wanted people to have the overseas rate when recovering back, but the methodology means that it can't really be justified.
I do agree that it should be looked at over the course of your career. For example, when I posted last year, we had the £1,041, and we certainly didn't spend all of that moving into that SFA. So one of the aspects of going overseas, not necessarily posting, but when we deploy and all that, is LSA. One of the questions we had was, why is LSA taxed?
Yeah, very good question. I get it quite a bit when I go around doing presentations. The simple answer is that compensatory allowances are. So as such, they're considered additional income. So you've earned that due to activity, and therefore the government classes it as income, so therefore it's taxed. In an ideal world, it wouldn't be. But because you're not being contributed to for, expenditure, you're actually being rewarded for activity, then our good partners at HMRC consider that income, and therefore it must be taxed. We have in allowances policy sort of contributory, which is never usually the full amount. So that is, let's take disturbance expense that we've just spoken about, and therefore that retains its tax-free status. But if it's compensatory based on activity, it tends to be taxed. Now, sometimes some compensatory allowances, the head office can meet the tax liability. But in LSA's case, HMRC pretty clear that it is to be taxed against the individual. So, yeah, it remains a compensatory allowance, therefore taxed.
And a lot of the stipulations and like requirements and that is dictated by like HMRC, and it's not like the military is trying to screw people over and save money. It's like it's higher up that.
Oh no, absolutely. You're bob on. Everything must pass muster with the Treasury and HMRC. And even though we've got 78 plus allowances and expenses, each one it undergoes sort of a rigorous review, and one of those things is we understand how valued they are, especially in the tax-free space, and constant liaison between MOD and HMRC occurs in order to make sure that we don't erode the offer, and then confirm what the tax compliance answer is for each of the allowances. So yeah.
Cool. So sort of staying on the vein of like overseas, so LOA, how does that compensate for a spouse's earnings or the loss of the spouse's earnings?
Okay, it's a superb observation and a really good question. I think to talk about compensation and LOA, the language needs to be tighter. And what I mean by that is LOA is not compensatory in its nature. So again, we go back to that compensatory or contributory element of allowances. And so the potential loss of sort of spouse or partner employment when you are accompanied on an overseas assignment is a real macro strategic issue. This actually concerns more than just the military. This concerns a lot of companies in the private sector as well, in that due to the UK economy and what the trends have been over the last 15, 20 years, the need for two incomes in a family household has become quite clear for many. And so that can have a bit of a conflict when it comes to overseas opportunities. I have no doubt the conundrum that families face where if the partner is in employment, let's say in the United Kingdom, and you are told your unit is moving to Cyprus, for example, that is a pretty difficult set of decisions that a family needs to make in terms of, do I as the SP go and serve unaccompanied in Cyprus for 2 to 3 years, whatever it may be, or do I bring my family and potentially have to ask my partner to give up their employment in the United Kingdom and maybe earn nowhere near as much when in an overseas assignment? So it's a real strategic issue for defence in that we want to attract the best in overseas assignments, but we're up against a UK economy trend that doesn't necessarily neatly fit with a lot of overseas locations. Now, there's going to be partners out there that have remote working opportunities, in-country opportunities, or whatever it may be, but if they have an established career that they enjoy, and if it rewards, let's say, more than a service person, it can really be a retention issue for defence. But whilst that gets assessed at the highest levels of how do we approach that in the future, local overseas allowance is a contribution, a tax-free contribution that aims to treat the difference in cost of living between the UK and the LOA area. It's actually got nothing to do with spousal employment in its methodology whatsoever. And we try to communicate that when we're out on the ground. Not the answer I don't think people wish to have, but that macro strategic issue I've spoke about has been elevated to the highest levels, and it is a real big concern for Defence People team and how we approach employment for our people overseas in the future.
As you said, I think it does go back to that difference between compensatory and contributory allowances. Home to duty, the mileage requirements are different for someone who lives in a private rented or owned property to someone who lives in service accommodation. Why is there that kind of difference between the mileage?
Yeah, superb observation. I think having lived both sides of this, I can absolutely understand the view of people in, let's say, a private accommodation who, and it used to be my view, when I was privately renting somewhere, was, well, hold on, I am less of a financial burden on the system in that I am not in subsidised accommodation. Why do I have to contribute more in terms of the personal contribution in order for my home to duty to then kick in? Why am I on 9 miles and someone in SFA who is enjoying public subsidised accommodation only having 3, and it's a constant debate back and forward. The other side of the argument is that those in public accommodation have very limited choice on the location of where they live, and so because of that limited choice, then it is deemed appropriate for people to have 3 miles. Now, there's lots of debate across the single services, whether it's Air Force, Navy or Army, about what does the future look like with home to duty in trying to bring some parity. But I think whilst the modernised accommodation offer is going through its review at the moment, talk about harmonising the personal contribution has probably cooled off a little bit until we see what the future looks with the accommodation offer, because in the future it may look like people have greater choice on the location of public accommodation options, and therefore that would probably strengthen the argument for some harmonisation of that personal contribution. But as at now, it's 3 for public, 9 for private, acknowledging that it's a decent argument from those in private accommodation. However, those in public often don't choose the exact location of where they wish to live, and therefore receive a more generous offer on the personal contribution of 3 miles.
You mentioned now, obviously, the modernised accommodation offer. With the pause and now the review, there was certainly some confusion as to actually what went live on the 11th of March. And some of the questions were, how does this affect the over 37s package?
Okay, perfect. Right, so the over 37s provision is being partially deconstructed. What does that mean in real speak? I suppose the Army briefing note that we released on the 22nd of March, it was the second iteration of that because of the ever-evolving changes to the modernised accommodation offer. We had to clarify and change a couple of things in that ABN, but that gives the basics on it, in that after the 1st of April 2024. Now, the over 37 provision has actually got 3 elements to it, but I think we'll just focus on the SLA waiver element because that seems to be what most people are concerned about. No new applicants were allowed to go onto the over 37 provision under that SLA waiver after the 1st of April 24. But if you were a current claimant or you were currently enjoying that provision, you would stay, for JPA purposes and simplicity and delivery, you would stay on that option until either your next assignment or until we know what the results of this review of the MAO are going to be. Now, we weren't going to take anything off anyone. New applicants were to go onto this new dual accommodation waiver, and that's just all it is on JPA is a different drop-down option. So no change to that offer for those people that maintain a home elsewhere, and actually it's probably become a little bit more generous in that the 50-mile rule is not explicit on this yearly waiver out to 2025. So if you maintain a home somewhere else that you don't daily commute from, i.e. it's not your RWA, and you live in the block in the week and you go home to your property that you either own or rent or whatever it may be and I'm being very careful not to breach into accommodation policy here, but you will get a waiver. So that will be a guaranteed waiver out until 2025, probably around April time. What they've said in the communications from accommodation policy is that anyone who will have a change to that waiver will be given 3 months notice. Now, what the future looks like is work ongoing in the accommodation policy space. And so, yeah, I'm probably not going to speculate, Cameron, but when people get worried about the over 37s provision being scrapped, I would say that it's no longer open to new claimants. If you're on it at the moment, you will remain on it until you're assigned out. And if your conditions are the same, you'll just simply go onto a different JPA drop down in order to continue to enjoy that dual accommodation waiver.
So that is now live, is it?
Yeah. So that went live 1st of April. And so, if down at the tactical level, unit HR, I don't know what drop down you're talking about, the actions on is for them to go into the REO into brigade into PERS admin branch, and they have given quite clear direction about what option is to be utilised on JPA.
Cool. Thanks for clarifying that. And then just the last one that we had on allowances was just about the civilian clothing allowance and how does that actually work?
Okay, yeah. So 2 elements to that one on civilian clothing. You've got the civilian clothing daily allowance and the civilian clothing annual grant. And that's a contribution towards extra expenditure to sort of non-commissioned service personnel. Now, that happens if you necessarily incur costs as a direct consequence of being required to wear civilian clothing on duty. There's a list of a cohort in JSP 752 who says who is eligible. Notice how I mentioned about non-commissioned officers get a tax relief through their pay, so they are ineligible for this. But CCDA, the daily allowance, is payable when SP are required to wear civilian clothes under sort of a 12-month period. So I'll take a recent example of recruiting group individuals in Northern Ireland who are required to wear civilian clothes when they pop around for 6 months on the ground. That's absolutely applicable for them to receive that payment of CCDA. Where it kind of absolutely goes over that 12-month period and it's guaranteed block, that is when people would be getting the civilian clothing annual grant, which is £416 a year. For the daily, it's £1.14 per day. I think it's a good thing. I think, if you're required due to your duties to consistently wear civilian clothing and that can be damaged or torn or whatever it may be, or just needs to, you need to look a particular way in a particular role, then you'll be eligible for that. And there's quite a long list in 752 of the people that it applies to. Think about people that must operate in plain clothes, for example. But if there is, examples out there where people feel that, hold on, I'm wearing my civilian clothes on duty for greater than 60 days within 12 months, then please staff it in through unit HR that if you're in a role that requires that and there's clear evidence, then please staff it in and it'll come all the way up to us. And we'll do our best to get it included as a cohort.
Will, thank you again for taking the time and clarifying and answering all of them.
Perfect. Thank you, Cameron.
Thanks again to Will for taking the time to answer those questions. My biggest takeaway was the difference between contributory and compensatory allowances and the many nuances that come with those, and just allowances in general. Hopefully you now have a better understanding of these topics, and the added context has helped you understand the why behind certain methodology. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below and any further questions you might have. They could be used in a future episode. Thank you all for watching. If you liked what you just saw, please hit the subscribe button up there, and if you want to see some more videos, click over there. See you soon.